Well, hello, my friends in the gathering. It seems like we are good to go tech-wise. I hope you're doing well. This is Pastor Bob coming to you for another week as we walk through Genesis. And I hope you've really found it enjoyable. I know I've had a wonderful time sitting the text, studying it for you and for me, and just pouring over it. And I learn new things every single time I do this. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to jump into it and to study and share it with you and go through it together and learn from it together. So I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for the whole team, leadership team, Judd and Bill and the other Bill and all the entire team, all you folks involved in this. And I also want you to know that I'm praying for you during this season, as I know you'd much rather be together than be on a computer screen, seeing my face and Ryan's face. But again, we'll just continue to walk through this every single day as the Lord commands us to be faithful and to be obedient and to just walk in step with his word. So thank you so much again for this opportunity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right into it, and I want to pray, and we'll get us going here, okay? So, gracious Father, I just want to come to you thankful for the opportunity to come with my brothers and sisters and to learn more about you, and to learn more about your word, and to pour over Genesis chapters 22 and 23. Lord, I thank you for Pastor Ryan teaching last week as he gave us the delivered promise in Isaac to Abraham and the story there, and then the tragic story of Hagar and Ishmael, and then the interesting story with Abimelech. And so, Father God, I pray that as we continue this narrative, as we talk about that moment of faith for Abraham, that the penultimate moment where he just connected in his faith to you and trusted you, God, I pray that you give us wisdom and discernment on what we can learn from that story and how we can utilize such faith in our lives as we walk with you in a season that's gone crazy. Holy Spirit, I do pray that you be with me in my teaching. Give me wisdom and guidance to what you want me to share, and lead me in what you want me to discuss. And anything that is not of you, I pray that these folks forget, or that you correct me. And may we just walk in step on with you, Spirit, honoring you and honoring the word in the best way we can. So we love you. We praise you. God, we are so grateful for you. And I ask all this in the loving name of Jesus Christ to give you glory, Father, in the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. So as I mentioned here, Pastor Ryan last week did a phenomenal job of discussing the story of Isaac and Hagar and Ishmael and Abimelech. And so what we're going to dive into this week is we're going to talk through our different lessons here that we see in Genesis chapter 22 to verse 23. And what I'm going to do is I am just going to make sure that I am sharing the correct screen here. Just double check. Yep, looks like I'm good to go. All right, and we're going to get moving here. So again, thank you to the entire team of the gathering for allowing myself and Pastor Ryan to teach during the season. It's a real blessing. So again, the title of our talk this summer is God's Promise, Genesis 16 through 50. Last summer we did chapters 1 through 15. It took us 14 weeks to do that. And so we're going to finish up 16 through 50 in a similar set of weeks. Again, I'm Bob Drew. I'm the group's pastor at the SBC Shea campus, and very privileged and honored to serve your group and serve your community in the gathering. Pastor Ryan, he is the SBC Shea venue pastor, and he also is very blessed and grateful to teach. This week I was talking to him last week about how excited he has been to come to you every single week. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Now, we're going to cover today Abraham, Isaac, and faith. We're going to talk through Genesis chapters 22 through 23. But a quick reminder of our 12-week theme here for the summer is God's promise, faith through families. So God's promise, faith through families. So we're getting to the big moment here with the faithful moment between Abraham and the Lord, and this promise really rocketing forward. And so let's dive right into it with a little bit of recap so we can bridge over from Pastor Ryan's message correctly. So last week, Pastor Ryan covered a few things here. One, he talked about Abraham's flawed ability, that he was a deeply flawed man, that he had his issues, that he still, time and time again, after God had shown him that he was there and he loved him, had that problem with Abimelech and Sarah. Thankfully, because of God's goodness, he protected Abraham from faltering. But again, we see that he was very much a man, very much human, which gives more highlight to God's promises and his goodness. We also see faithful context that, as Pastor Ryan shared, usually in Abraham's stories, the other characters we meet are more faithful than Abraham is. Now, Lot obviously is an exception to that rule. But again, if you think of all the men and folks that he had run into in his journeys, Abraham is learning a little bit from them about what it means to be faithful, which is very interesting. Divine election. We see that God's promise to Abraham was based on divine election, not so much Abraham's faithfulness. Now, the faithfulness was a reaction to God's divine election, but God certainly restated that it was his will and his desire to pick Abraham and the line of Israel that would come from him. And then God's promise fulfilled. Isaac is born and is the son of that promise. That is fully brought forth, even as I discussed 2 weeks ago with Sarah's kind of giggling or laughter at God, not out of disrespect, but out of humanness. How could that happen? How could that be? Well, here we see that promise was fulfilled in Isaac. And then lastly, we see this God's provision in the story of Hagar and Ishmael, as he provided for them and gave them a promise for their survival due to the results of what occurred between Sarah and Abraham and them. So tragic story, but again, we praise God that he too takes care of everybody and everyone in that role. So like I like to do to kind of give us a check-in each week is take a look at the recap of Abraham's life and see how far we've gotten. Well, we're getting down to the end here. We are right here in Abraham challenged to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And so we're going to cover the last 2 boxes here, but we're not going to get to the death of Abraham. Pastor Ryan will get to that next week as he jumps in. So when we look at a timeline of Abraham's life, we're right here in this big red circle. We've been tracking this one for weeks, even into last summer. That now we are right at that moment where God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And that's where we're going to pick up in the narrative. And so we're going to go from there to talking about Abraham and Isaac, go to Moriah, and then we're going to go all the way down to the preparation of the sacrifice and then up to Sarah's burial. So we're going to cover a big chunk of this lesson and the rest of Abraham's life tonight or today, whatever you might be watching this. Now, lastly, too, geography is key. Geography is important. I'd encourage you that while I know it's not the most attractive part of biblical studies, geography is extremely important. And so the Lord chose the land specifically for very important reasons. These towns have a high level of importance and value as he discusses or shares what he shows us in Scripture. So we have to set the kind of the location here, our context. Again, this is our last part of Abraham in Canaan, and where his life pretty much comes to an end in this region. And this is what the world looked like at this time. I know I've showed you this before, but again, keep note that we are pretty much right here hanging out in this region, in this area, with a little bit into the north, but not too much. So right here is where we're going to be landing for a lesson. So let's jump into Genesis 22 now that we've set up what has been going on in 20 through 21, and then we talk through the local context. Now we talk about geography. We have this big scene now that's built up after what occurred. Abraham has the promise delivered to him through Isaac, that everything's sitting well, and now the narrative picks up there. So structurally, this is a very interesting story that we're going to unpack. We're going to do it pretty much by verse and by section. So first we have our introduction that we're going to go through, then God's command and sacrifice of Isaac to Abraham. Then that breaks into some subcategories. We have the departure where he actually heads out on the trip, which then kind of moves to the 3rd day at the foot of the mountain with a little bit backup of a journey up to the mountain. But then we see this next section in the sub-narrative of the story, a preparation for the sacrifice. Think of these as scenes in the act of the play. And then you have this totally new portion where the angel speaks to stop the sacrifice. And then you have an epilogue, which is a return to Beersheba. So here is this outline of what is going on in the text and what was going on. So let's jump into our first section, which is the introduction. All right. So Genesis 22, verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Now, a lot is going on here. And so what you'll notice in the lesson for this week is we're going to do real heavy in the beginning, and then it's going to go quickly as we get pretty much to the middle of our lesson today. So this scene begins a climaxing conversation between Abraham and God. It is meant to cushion the reader for the immense ask that God is about to ask of Abraham. So for the reader, it's meant to soften the blow a little bit. We see where he says, after these things, it's insinuating that everything that happened before happened over a certain time period. Pretty much focusing on the Sarah and Hagar, Ishmael, and Abimelech narrative. But we really don't know how long that is. Most scholars will argue that it's at least a few years, if not more. We'll see that it probably was many years because at this point, Isaac was most likely a teenager at minimum for his age. But that'll come up into play here in a few slides. Now, a couple things that we can note. The English language, you'll notice throughout the lesson, is going to portray us a little bit because the depth of Hebrew and the depth of the culture doesn't really do it justice when it comes to English translation at times. So this term for God, Elohim, right, one that's pretty common that we've heard of, is really an informal case and use of the word rather than how God was referenced earlier in a very familiar formal, or the Lord. So in this case, you see this more generic, general version of referencing to God versus a beautiful, formalized, personal version that we would expect between Abraham and the Lord in prior sections. Now, this could insinuate that God is leaving some mystery to his actions due to what is coming up, because it is less comfortable and it's a little bit more random. We'll see that again later. This is reinforced by the fact that after God reveals himself to Abraham later in the story, he goes from being referenced as Elohim, as God, to the more personal, the Lord, capital Lord. So it does get a little bit more, not a little bit more, a lot more intimate. But right now it seems a little bit distant, a little bit cold based on everything they've been gone through so far. Now, when we look at the word used for tested, or nisa, right, it shows that this testing is really about who someone is inside, what they're like at the heart, and what they're discerned by when it comes to difficulties and hardships, right? So basically, who are you when things get tough? That is what that word tested means. Now, we know this because it occurred later with Daniel and his friends, Israel in the wilderness, through false prophets and foreign oppression. This happened later in Scripture, and this word was used in the exact same context. So the purpose of such trial is to test what is in one's heart. That is what God is getting at here, and that is the purpose of that specific use of that word. And because of this setup, Abraham knew that God was about to ask him something of great difficulty. So God approached him less formal or less personal and a little bit more formal. But at the same time, this testing, the narrative of the story here meant that he was going to test his heart. So something really rough was coming his way. Now, again, remember the context. Abraham got everything he wanted. I know he didn't love sending away his son. He had some grief in his heart for that with Ishmael. But Sarah had a child. The promise was fulfilled, and things were beautiful and moving along. But then the Lord comes and says, well, I have a very big challenge for you. Well, when we continue to look at this, we see that this divine monologue begins. And here in the pink, you'll see this noted 3 more times throughout our lesson. It's this trade-off where Abraham was referenced, and then Abraham responds. So Abraham, in this case, he said, Abraham, and Abraham's response was, here I am. This is something we need to key in on, because this is a response between whoever's calling Abraham and Abraham's response, showing that a heightened increase in the tension of the story. So it shows these moments in the story when the development is getting a little bit rougher and a little bit more difficult. So again, I've highlighted those for us so we can pay attention to them as we go on. So as we move forward in the story, we see God's command, sacrifice your son, Genesis 22:2. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering, on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. So keeping in mind the word test that we just talked about, discerning his heart, we see this scene accelerate drastically. God commands Abraham to take his son for sacrifice. Now, there's some things to note here before we move on. In English, structure, again, can betray us. When we look at our text, we would usually skip over the Hebrew, at least when reading in English. But there is this little enclitic that is put in here, it's pronounced na, and it means please. So when he says, take your son, your only son Isaac, it's more along the sense where God is doing it more gingerly. He's doing it a little bit more softly. It's a rare use in divine commands that makes it more likely that in entreaty, another hint that the Lord is appreciating the cost of what he's about to ask. So it's not this harsh, mean, I'm going to bring the hammer down on you. This is a more softer, this is going to be hard, and I want you to do this. Again, it's not directly please, because God doesn't need to ask permission of us to do anything, but it is him giving a softer hand to what he's about to ask. And again, that can be missed right in the middle of this text. So notice that very important point there, because it does give us a tone of who God is in this story. It gives us a view of his personhood as we unpack that. Now, the character description then given of Isaac sums up the value of Isaac to Abraham. He's your only son. He's your son whom you love. So there's a great value to who Isaac is, and God is acknowledging that. He is the fulfillment of God's promises, and God himself is acknowledging that this fulfillment came in the form of Isaac. So even God himself is noting how much this sacrifice is going to cost. Now, prior to this, nothing would have rocked Abraham's faith regarding Isaac's life. He was born, and thus the promise was delivered. Now, remember, I mean that in the context of Isaac already coming and already being born. So things are really good for Abraham, especially if we believe Isaac is in his teen years, which we'll see again, most likely he was. He had years upon years of really healthy life with his son that he waited for forever. So now, out of the blue, there's this really hard decision. He had a choice. Does he choose God or does he choose his own desires? Well, we'll see how it goes. From here, God calls Abraham to head to Moriah aside from his clan, so apart by himself. In the Hebrew, I didn't dive into it for the sake of time, but he's asking him to go on his own and send his son away with him, right? And so the importance of this is that it means land of vision, Moriah, where he's going, giving insight to Abraham about what he'd experienced there. The tricky part is we don't know exactly where this mountain was. There's some agreement to where it could be, but regardless, the location's not as important as in terms of the actual physical geography, but also the name of Moriah, which in that time would have translated to land of vision. So Abraham again would have saw that he was going to get some increased depth of knowledge of who God is in this experience he's about to go through. So we continue on here. Well, this tragic ask where he goes into real depth of what has to occur here. The big offering, the big ask, God shares what he wants. He wants a burnt offering, and that involved cutting up and burning the whole animal on the altar. That was the most commonest type of sacrifice at that time period. So when he asked for a burnt offering, that is what Abraham would have thought of. He would have thought of, taking an animal purity, cutting it up, and then sacrificing that on the altar, burning it up to the Lord. But in this case, it's not an animal. This is a human being. This is his son. Now, this type of sacrifice would have denoted two things to the person offering sacrifice. The first is the offerer has given himself entirely to God. So it's submission, it's connecting to God, it's giving him all of himself. Then the second thing that was traditionally tied to sacrifice was it was the animal's death that atoned for the worshiper's sins. So the spilling of that blood would have been payment for that person's sins. Again, another Christological point to the future with Jesus. But again, this problem came that it wasn't an animal. This was a human being, a child. And at this time period, and frankly today, hopefully, sacrificing a child or human being was out of the question, especially to devout Orthodox worshipers. Even when the firstborn later in Scripture was to be offered to God in the future, that child was to be substituted with the sacrifice of an animal. We see that when they would offer another animal when a child was born versus sacrificing the life of itself. Even in the very, very, very rare cases when there's potentially alluded to that a child was sacrificed in Scripture, Judges 11, 31 through 40 speaks of this, also 2 Kings 3:27 and 17:7. It was in the most dire crises and seen as a taboo event. Unnatural, not what God would want, because of God's high view of sanctity of life. So this would have been a huge, huge thing to the reader in ancient times where they would have freaked out, and hopefully to you too. I would not want to do that with my son, or let alone any of my friends or you, sacrificing any human being whatsoever. So you have this drawing in of how emotional and extraordinary this ask was by God. And the reader would pretty much have been shocked by this asking. And we all should be too, frankly. Now, this is of both a moral and theological importance. We have to note, though, that the outcome of the incident makes it clear that God never intended the directive to be fulfilled. So we have the beauty of looking at the story from behind. It already occurred. We know that God did not actually have Isaac sacrificed. We know that he did provide a lamb. If you haven't read this story before, sorry, spoiler alert, that is what comes. But again, there was the intention of him testing who Abraham was and getting to a view of his heart. Now, obviously, if it went the other way and there was sacrifice, that would tell us something drastically different about who God is and his theology, and also the morals to which comes from his kingdom. But in this case, we know that's not true based on how the story ended. So keep that in mind, too, as we go on. Now, the last point I want to make is about the mountains here. Now, this would have been heightened the emotional complexity of the story and the pain in the moment. We don't get a lot of inclination of what Abraham was thinking. He doesn't talk about his comments at all. We're going to try to read into a little bit of his reaction and how he reacted to what God asked, but his emotional response was not verbally dictated. But what we can see is if he had to go to any mountain, no matter where Moriah was, for him to climb that mountain with his son, with all the gear, with the knife, and with all that was needed, also fire to get things going, it would have been a tragic, tragic moment as he climbed that mountain step by step with all those things, knowing what God had asked him to do. So this portion is meant to heighten the cost of what is happening in this story, to get the reader to be drawn into what is going on, but also to show an example of, the severity and the need and the emotional tie to faith. and what we are willing to do, even in the worst times when it comes to connecting with God. So the next part is the departure. Well, Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. So a couple things here too. Abraham responded immediately. Notice that he arose early in the morning, so there wasn't any time period that passed. He did it immediately. We don't know anything about what he was thinking about this. We just saw that he went, and he began to prepare all the necessary gear for the sacrifice. Now, a couple things here. We can read a little bit into what he might have been thinking based on his actions. A saddling in this phrase doesn't mean that he's just throwing a saddle on the donkey and walking away. He was getting ready for the trip. He was packing all the gear in the trunk, getting the donkey ready to go. He was gaining provision. He was recruiting travel companions. He had to talk to his son about what he wanted to do. But notice in this progression, he then cut the wood after all this was done. All right? Well, we have to ask ourselves, why not cut the wood, then saddle the donkey? Why prepare the animal first and then put all the wood on top of there? Well, this is a glimpse potentially into Abraham's disordered mind and pain. He might have been doing things textually incorrect, out of order, because he was fragmented. His mind was frazzled. God asked him to do something incredibly big. But notice that he's the one that did all the work too. So he would have been completely enamored with this task he was called to. And textually, a lot of scholars argue that this doesn't match the typical pattern of a clear biblical description when it comes to textual layout. So it is a little funny here, and there's something to look at there. I'll let you decide, but it might be a window into what he was thinking and how he was distracted. But no matter what the state of mind was, he did what he was told. That is very, very clear. He was called, he did what he was called to do. Now, you might be asking, well, he didn't go by himself, as you said earlier, and he brought, how did he know exactly where to go? Well, it is possible that God had shown Abraham where to specifically go and why he needed to bring men to the foot of the mountain. We don't really have clarity of that. What I'll say, in my personal opinion, this is my personal opinion, is even when he gets to the mountain, he still goes to the top with just him and Isaac. The men stay at the bottom of the mountain, which we'll see in a minute. So he did still honor God and what he called him to do. And maybe he, at the time period, that Moriah mountain was a very specific known place. The text just isn't very clear on that, so we're not going to read into it too much, but there is something to see that maybe there was additional communication going on here between him and the Lord. So we continue on. Now the journey towards the foot of the mountain. So here's a little map of the process here. Again, some scholars do believe that it was up here in the northern, Ramah, kind of this region. So regardless, here's at Beersheba. This is where he was camped out. He traveled up here or to this route through Hebron or maybe through Lachish. We don't know exactly which way he would have gone, but it would have made sense because we see in the text that he could see the mountain, and this geographically would have been the direction he would have been looking. So most likely was somewhere up here. We'll get to Hebron later, but again, he could have taken 2 of these directions and traveled through this region up here to Mount Moriah, which some scholars believe it was located. So we continue on with the text. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the word of burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. So again, 3 days is the biblical period mentioned for something here. Hopefully that brings you a recollection to Jesus. This was used throughout Scripture about the preparation time needed to do something very important, something of great importance. So it took 3 days for Abraham to get to the area, at which point he looked up, he lifted his eyes. It's another phrase that's used to show reverence in the Old Testament, also a little bit in the New Testament, where he was not just looking up because there's the mountain. He was looking up because he was looking up at a big task, something he was hugely called to. It also, again, builds tension for the pending event in the story. Now, upon arrival, Abraham does tell the men to stay at the foot of the mountain. So I mentioned that earlier. He heads up there by himself without the guys. And again, this is a clear parallel to Mount Sinai experience. When Moses was with the men of Israel at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and Moses said, "You wait here, I'm going up to engage God." Again, he's leaving all other parties not directly connected to the Lord out of the circle because there's something monumental that was about to happen. Something huge was about to happen. And while Abraham is committed to sacrificing Isaac, he plans to do so in belief that both of them will return. We see that where he tells the guys, "And we will worship and come to you again. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." So there is this belief on Abraham's side. We see in the text that he believed he was coming back with Isaac. Now, was he coming back with him as a body? Was he coming back to him fully? Was he coming back with a resurrected Isaac? The text doesn't say. What we do know is that Abraham trusted God and trusted that God's promise was going to be fulfilled. So he knew that Isaac was going to come back in some fashion. All right. Now, again, we see that no matter how he felt, he did feel called to his duty. So he ironically lays all the means needed to sacrifice his son on Isaac's back. Again, this is important as Isaac must have been physically able to carry this wood, this material. So this again is an illusion that Isaac was here most likely a teenage boy at minimum. He would have had the ability to carry the amount of wood and resources needed up the mountain with his father so that he could go and complete the sacrifice. This becomes important later because we know, remember, at this point, Abraham was elderly and Isaac would have been young in some fashion. But it would have been the first tip that something was going on to him. I love a commentator once said that Isaac was a condemned man, unknowingly carrying his own cross to this section. And again, the key is unknowingly, because with Jesus, he knowingly carried the pyres on his back for the sacrifice, versus Isaac here was unknowingly carrying his own cross, yet he was also obedient in whatever his father was telling him to do. Again, we see that they both of them went together. So even with this stacking of materials, Isaac was obeying his father. He didn't really know what was coming. I think he had a little bit of inclination. We'll see a little bit more of that in a minute. But again, they wanted to do what was needed. They were both on tabs for what God had called them to do. So you had a journey up the mountain. Dad and Isaac went up the mountain together. And we see in the text, Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. So now Isaac's starting to ask some questions, all right? I'll notice that, again, highlighted pink section, my father. Earlier, God called, the informal God called out to Abraham, and Abraham said, "Here I am." Now you have the son saying to his dad, "My father," and Abraham responds, "Here I am," but he adds in this little declaration or clarifier, "my son." This is an increase in the response, an increase in the tension. Isaac is not only noticing what is going on, but Abraham is being reminded of what he's about to come to. He references the person with him as his son, the promises of God shown in his baby boy grown into a young man. Now again, wherever he stands emotionally, we don't know, but he knows what he's about to give up. He knows that he has to pursue this action and that he has a choice. And we also see that Isaac notices that there's no lamb. There's no animal for sacrifice. Now, was he weary and then caught up on what was happening? Was he truly ignorant to what was going on? Did he catch on yet was silent and okay with it due to his faith in God? We don't really know. Again, we don't know that. But let's not get distracted by what we don't know. Let's get distracted by what we do know. We notice two things. Isaac is shown to have the same qualities of perfection looked for in a sacrificial victim, the lamb, because again, it was mentioned earlier in the text. And if Isaac was an appropriate sacrifice compared to a lamb, we know that this perfection, this holiness was shown in him, shown in the promise. Well, he was good enough. But also we can note our appreciation of the trustful love that existed between father and son in this moment. Isaac still did what dad wanted him to do. He was pursuing what he called him to do. No matter how Isaac understood it, Abraham trusted that God would provide the lamb needed, whether it was his son or an actual lamb. And Isaac, the son, answered. He answered. Now, again, this story is more about Abraham than Isaac, but we do see that there's this obedience going on. But we also see that Abraham would show a consistent trust in God no matter what. God could stop him, supply him, resurrect him, or do something else. But either way, Abraham trusted God. They were both obedient again. Notice this phrase here. So they both went on. So they went, both of them, together. Well, here we go. It's starting to build up here. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. Now the event has now come to its climax. Abraham has officially arrived at the place God told him to go to. And again, this is a reminder to the reader that Abraham was obedient. He made it all the way to the top of the mountain. The anticipation was rising because we could see that the reader, us, are looking at this text and seeing a very detailed picture about the sacrificial process. The altar was built. The wood was laid. Isaac was bound. This is by no means a easy, quick process. He wasn't just thrown on the ground and then a blowtorch was taken out. He had to build an altar. He had to lay it all out. He had to put the wood down. He had to put Isaac on top of it. And then we see a little bit now his next step in that. So we have to ask this question, though. Well, what about this binding thing? Abraham bound Isaac. It's here where we do have to ask why. Because there's nothing in the Old Testament later that endorses a binding of a sacrifice, especially not in Leviticus 1, which we'll see a lot of instruction on how to offer a proper sacrifice. And since the lamb was to be unblemished, we know that killing Isaac prior by slitting his throat, which would have been, again, how they would have done it with the lamb, was not appropriate because it had to have been without blemish. It would not have worked. So we're kind of left with only one conclusion, that Abraham was elderly and Isaac was young, right? And it would be very difficult for an elderly man, close to his hundreds, if not older, and a teenager, 13 plus, to overcome and to subdue an unwilling participant. We see that Isaac had to have willingly given his hands and feet to be bound to his father. So at that point, he would have known what was going on. We would not have seen an elderly Abraham, because he was just a human being. We would not have seen him jump on his son, tie him up, and overpower him, as Isaac, again, remember, was strong enough to carry wood up a mountain as his dad carried a knife, get to the top, and then be wrestled down for the event. We also don't see it in the text. So it's most likely logical to think that Isaac gave himself up willingly for this act. We see that whatever the cost, the son was now obedient as the father. He was pursuing obedience in this. So we look at verse 10 and we see the next scene hastens the pace of the story. Abraham reached for the horrific device, the knife, and is getting ready to obey to the end, whatever that may be. He still doesn't know how this is going to end. And notice this word slaughter here used to show that this act was unthinkable, that it was truly abominable. It was an awful thing that was going to occur. And then we see now this deed put in further perspective when in verse 10, Abraham reached out to slaughter his son, his long-awaited son, a reminder to us as the readers, but also a reminder to Abraham about what he was about to do in this act. It's incredibly painful and incredibly tense. Well, thank God, right? I mean that thanks God for his solution. We see the story grow further in Genesis 22, 15 through 18. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said, to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Thankfully, the angel of the Lord intercedes in this moment. Now, again, this is the same angel of the Lord referenced back in chapter 16, verse 7, and it is a given authority to speak on God's behalf. Scholars argue that maybe it was the voice of the Lord. We don't know. We just know that the angel of the Lord phraseology was used as a messenger earlier in the text and in some few places later in the text of the Old Testament. Either way, this voice, whether it was God or an angel, had full authority representing God, and they were speaking on God's behalf. We also see this in 21 verse 1, and it represents God's covenant name with Isaac, which was promised to Abraham. So this all comes full circle. The strange God who tested Abraham once again, remember when I said God informal, when he referenced himself in verse 1, the strange God who tested Abraham once again shows himself to be the gracious Lord who keeps his promises. Angel of the Lord, he reveals himself further to Abraham. Abraham again responds, here I am. So again, we see this third couplet between Abraham being addressed and Abraham responding. But this time now, the first time, remember, it was God speaking to him informally. Then it was the son, Isaac, speaking to his father. And now it was the very personal, real God speaking, Abraham, Abraham, to Abraham, and Abraham responds. It was much more intimate, and also as a portion of anticipation for the reader. We see that Abraham is called to do no harm to his son. The burden is completely taken. And God now confirms that Abraham's faith is true of heart, tested in fear and in certainty. So Abraham passed the test. He carried through what God wanted him to do, and God provided that solution. Abraham was willing to give everything to God in faith. Now, we have to note that there's no reply from Abraham to God. We don't see any exchange on behalf of Abraham to God. It seems as if Abraham is just listening. Although Abraham has passed the test, God does provide a ram so that it may be sacrificed as a burnt offering for Abraham. Again, this is to show the generosity and graciousness of God, that even in the harshest times, God will continue to provide in times of uncertainty and in pain. In Genesis, again, remember, the sacrifices are associated with solemn promises made by God. And again, this is the case instead of his son. God was going to provide. The fact that a ram died, matter of fact, in the place of Isaac has led many Christian interpreters to see introduced here the principle of substitutionary atonement, which would later become a reality in the substitutionary sacrificial death of Christ and the Son as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. That's John 1:29. Whatever way you go with it, we see that there is this portion where God is substituting something for a high cost, a high take. My personal opinion is that it is actually a substitutionary sacrificial allusion to the future of what Christ did. But again, we don't see that directly in the text, and I'll let you decide what that is. Now, in the end, here's what matters. God had provided immediately. In sacrifice, the animal symbolically represents the offerer whose place it took. So here, Abraham notes that God has indeed provided by symbolically naming the mountain. Now, this is similar to what Hagar did back in 16:13-14 with the well, where she was saying God is a provider. He does give us all that we need. So we do see a response to Abraham, but it's after this providing moment. I don't know what Abraham was thinking. I don't know what he said. I would hope that he was sitting there crying, holding his son. But again, don't read too much in the text. We don't know. But I know when I think of my children, boy, I think that's what I would do. So either way, this is a moment of celebration for Abraham, and what a burden taken off his shoulders in this tense moment. Well, we continue on as we see, and the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven. Verse 16, and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. A second time, God spoke to Abraham through the angel of the Lord, underlying the importance of what is to be said. Anytime you see repetition like this, especially in the Old Testament, tune in a little bit more when it's this close together, because that means the author is trying to get us to hone in. God's trying to get us to pay attention to what's going on here. This is the only divine oath made by God amongst any of the patriarchs. The only divine oath on his behalf made to any of the patriarchs. So again, this is hugely important. Because this was declared by God, which appears, by the way, 364 times in the Old Testament, it's highlighting that God's dependable. Anytime in Scripture where it says declared by God, or God declares, or declares the Lord, is showing the dependability of God, but also the power of God. That's why it's dependable, because it comes from the Lord. It comes from the sovereign one. It comes from Yahweh. Now, God's promise is now surely, which also in the text means really, secured. Now, this is meant to show an extra blessing, not any type of deception. It wasn't that it wasn't secure before. He's saying now it's really secure. Man, you are super blessed now because of your faith. And in addition, it has now shown that the promise is from God's will. It is his plan, and it will be done. So not only is it just an offer or a promise based on reaction, it's in God's plan. He's saying, I'm owning this. This is my will, and it will be done. That is what's most important. And then finally, Abraham's nation is secured. Descendants from Abraham will come bountifully. Notice the response of repetition of your offspring. 3 times we see it here in the text. But then in the red here, think back to the promises that God had given to Abraham. You see a promise to Abraham himself, a promise to Abraham in his offspring, through his son, then offspring and his nations. Then all the nations of the earth will be blessed, the line of Abraham, every single one of them. And all of this was due to God's promise to Abraham finally being restated, and the security of it being grounded in God as a result of Abraham's ultimate faith. So Abraham, in response of faith, was honored because of God. Abraham's not greater than God by any means. We know that. I remember the divine election Pastor Ryan talked about. But what he's saying is that faith is crucially important to the promises God gives us. And this faith secured Abraham's current nation, future nation, and then all of our nations through the line of Abraham, which we know is going to come in the form of Jesus and is lived out in Jesus now, which is hugely, hugely important. Faith is beyond important, whether it's in times of ease or times of strife. That is what God is telling us. So then we have this little epilogue here at the end of the text, just in verse 19, where it says, "So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba." Now, this is simply a closeout to the story. Abraham indeed returns with Isaac to the men at the foot of the mountain. He goes with those men and Isaac back home, where he lived, down to Beersheba, and his faith was fulfilled. But note also there's no mention of Sarah, and I only point that out to say a lot of movies and media and even commentaries will point out that Sarah's response here, well, there is no response from Sarah. She's not in the story right now. We don't know what she would have thought. This is all about Abraham's wholehearted obedience to God and the great blessings that have flowed from it. With that said, though, I'm pretty sure that Sarah, whether she knew what was going on or that she learned later what had happened, was extremely happy and grateful to see her son, if not shocked, in that moment. But again, we know how the story ended, and we know that love abounded in that moment. So we continue on here to this, again, a little weird spot here at the end of Genesis 22 that's a little confusing. And here's the outline of the section here. It's a totally new section, fit right in here at the end in 4 short verses. It's the genealogy of Rebekah. And so this comes from Milcah's sons and then Ruma's sons, which we're going to see this breakdown here in a 2-part narrative. So real quick, genealogies often show a cutoff of a story in the Old Testament. We covered that, or in Genesis. We covered that in last summer. Anytime a genealogy is brought up, it's usually the beginning of a new section. So that's how we knew this is unrelated to the story prior. But it is a continuation of the story, which is important. Now, after these things, it was told to Abraham, "Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz, his firstborn, Buz, his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother." Now, again, we don't know how long this occurred after the Isaac story. Notice it says after these things, but it's most likely anything from a few weeks to a couple months, even a year. That's what's mentioned. And here's why they say it this way. Abraham was told by somebody, we don't know who, that his brothers had children. We don't know what that happened, but it could have occurred through a traveling family member or even through a passing caravan at this time period. Now, the phrase about Milcah insinuates that she too had issues with, like Sarah, and this was some type of surprise to him. Again, "Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahuz." So this had occurred most likely right before this happened in the narrative during the whole Isaac sacrifice story. So this was a surprise to him. And it was also a surprise because it seems that Nahor's kids were born before Isaac, which is really key, which I'm not really surprised by because of the story, but the way the text lays out, it's showing some type of surprise. Now, for the sake of time, we're going to skip this genealogy because it would be a lot more time, but there are some biblical notes that can be made. If interested, shoot me an email. I'm happy to give you more. But what is important is this bracketed section in the text that Bethuel was the father of Rebekah. It's the most important character noted here, which is Rebekah. Abraham thus knew about Rebekah before he sent his servants in Genesis 24 to find Isaac a bride. So that's key. Abraham knew that Rebekah was there when he sent his servant in Genesis 24. It wasn't a surprise. He knew what he was doing. He was sending the servant to a place where he knew he had female relatives for his son Isaac to marry. And we also see this listed out of 12 males. So the males here, but then 8, and do the math. I'll let you deal with that part. Now, here, the future is most dominating for Rebekah. We see that for a woman to be listed in a genealogy of men at this time period would have been very unique. So it's kind of as if her future as the most dominating of the particular wives is already hinted at in the first mention of her existence, which is really key. So we continue on. We see Ruma's sons, this little continued branch out, that moreover his concubine, Nahor's concubine, whose name was Ruma, bore Teba, Gam, Tahash, and Makah. Now, Nahor, this is Nahor's concubine. This term really means second-class wife, somebody that was most likely acquired without a payment of bride money, which means she had a few legal rights than other women. The 3 sons of Ruma are noted to be connected to major towns existing today in Lebanon or Syria, but nothing more is really given on this. Whatever the relationship is between these names and the Aramaean tribes or political groups later in history, we really don't know what they are. So we're just going to say that they're just simply the names of Nahor's sons. Also, nothing else is mentioned about her here, which is pretty important. So why is this genealogy here? What is the importance of this? Well, it seems slightly anticlimactic, but it's actually the continuation of the story. From here, it is from the seeds of Nahor that the story progresses further, highlighted through the important mention of Rebekah. So we see this very unique timeline of the family tree for Abraham, right? But we see this connection in the family as it spreads down here to Laban and then down to Esau and Jacob and these other relatives, Leah, Dinah, down to the tribes of Israel. So it is very, very important. It's the link in the story to continue forward. So Genesis 23, you might be sitting there going, well, oh boy, man, you just covered 45 minutes on just one chapter. This one's actually pretty quick, shockingly. So we're going to cover it pretty straightforward here. Here's the outline. I'll leave this in the PowerPoint, but this is what we're covered through here. So Sarah's age, then her death, then we're going to discuss negotiations for the grave plot, then Abraham's land, pays for the land, then Sarah's burial in the summary. So that's kind of how it breaks out. And you'll see these little subcategories here in verses 3 through 15, all right? So first, Sarah's age, all right? Sarah's age. Sarah lived 127 years, and these were the years of the life of Sarah. The mention of Sarah in Genesis 21:12 was the last time she was mentioned prior to this. So Sarah has been out of the picture up until now, since Genesis 21, verse 12. That's when she ordered Ishmael's expulsion. Now, while the phraseology here is a bit odd, her notation is unique on its own. Sarah is the only wife of the patriarchs to have her age mentioned upon her death. Scholars argue over the meaning of this, and the Midrash, for example, an ancient commentary on part of the Hebrew scriptures, states that the number 127 symbolizes 100 for great age, 20 for beauty, and 7 for blamelessness. Either way, we have to note this, that it shows her mention is one of honor. So Sarah was not dishonored after what happened, even with Ishmael. She was very important, and we'll see that also in Abraham's grief here in the future. So Sarah's death and Abraham's mourning. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So Kiriath Arba, Hebron, is the traditional site located about 20 miles south of Jerusalem on the way to Beersheba. This region is close to where Abraham received the bulk of God's promises. And the Hebraic phrase used to explain the type of grieving Abraham had during this time is very unique. It's not one of just simply him missing his wife. It was one of deep grief that would have involved these rites. We know this when it says that he went in, that he actually went in to do something. He went into the tent, most likely, before the dead body of his wife to grieve her. And so customs of that time period would involve this: rendering of his clothes, disheveling of his hair, cutting his beard, scattering dust on his head, and fasting. These rites would have been carried out right in front of the corpse. And again, we see that he would have done that in front of her. So it was a really deep mourning. Abraham, in summation, was deeply grieved when his wife died. He went into the tent where his wife lay and mourned her in both posture and action. He loved her, and that's what's really important to note here. So a little rendering of what Hebron would have looked like at that 19th century view of what we kind of depicted in these days. But again, you'll see a hilly land and lush regions. Would have been obviously not as built up at that time period, but it again was a place of resources which were important, all right? So we see now that while Abraham was in this state, he had to decide what to do. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place that I may bury my dead out of my sight. So here we see that he did indeed rise up. He went away from the body of Sarah when the rites were finished, and he turned to the local Hittites, which were the sons of Seth, descended from Canaan. You can find that in Genesis 10:15. And these would have been good men, friends of Abraham and each member of the family. We know that because they had good Semitic names like Ephron, Sohar, Uriah. Again, later in the text and earlier in the text, we see that. So these are not strongly connected folks historically to the Hittites of Asia Minor. They're a much smaller subgroup. So that's really important to note because that can create some historical confusion later as you study history. Now, Abraham is explaining his legal status to these folks. He's a foreigner in their land. He's an immigrant and has no legal rights to obtain burial land for his wife. Immigrants at this time period were often abused and taken advantage of. They had no rights and were exploited quite often. So Abraham was asking for land from the local owners to bury his wife. He was going to them, asking them for permission. And he really, in that time period, would have no standing. And the way he describes Sarah shows that he was in deep mourning, that he would bury his dead out of his sight. He had this burden for him. So he came to them not just as a a businessman, he came to them with a lot of pain that he was trying to process through. Well, what would the Hittites reply? Let's take a look at it. The Hittites answered Abraham, "Hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead." The Hittites' response was one of warmth and sympathy. The introduction shows an intimate desire to connect with a man who just called himself an outcast, wanting to help him and bring him comfort. Abraham, remember, calls himself an immigrant, and the Hittites call him a prince. This was endearing and an act of deep compassion. They offer Abraham their best land for Sarah. Interestingly, though, they declare that none of them will get in the way of his honor and grief. However, note that they asked that while Abraham asked for a burial place or a plot of land for his family, the Hittites offered him a tomb, a single tomb. So while they were loving and while they were endearing, they were reluctant to give Hittite land to Abraham. This will play out in the preceding or the verses coming right after this, in a little bit of banter of hospitality. So Abraham requests a very specific location for his burial plot. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land, and he said to them, "If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat me for me, Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place." Now he was encouraged by their offer, Abraham was, by the Hittites' offer, and he bowed in reverence to them to show his gratitude. But this also begins a process of hospitable negotiation between the two parties. Since negotiations at the time period were handled sitting down, Abraham bowing would have shown that he was about to ask them for something big. He was taking a posture of humility. Now we also know that the people of the land most likely denoted local officials, maybe similar to elders in that culture. They were decision makers. So oddly, Abraham is trying to repeat their phrase in his language, where again he says, "If you're willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight." He's trying to rephrase what they were saying, but clarify it based on what he was asking for. So he was trying to work off of their offer, basically. And so the cave of Machpelah is most likely an area rather than a single cave. He's referencing a direct region. And again, we know this because it goes back to Josephus, that traditionally this is the resting place of the patriarchs. I believe there's a mosque built on it today in that region. But it has traditionally been the site of the patriarchs, even to this day, historically. Now, Abraham points out that yes, while he wants Ephron's burial place, it is really only a small part of the land he owns. Notice here he says it is at the end of his field. So he's saying, I don't want anyone's major plot of land. I just want this little piece of land. But we also know that he's offering a full price. Abraham is showing that he not only is interested in buying his wife a place to be buried, but also owning the land she's buried on for his family. He's bringing clarification to the thing that they admitted earlier. Remember, they offered a tomb, but he wants the land. He wants to own the piece of land. Well, this is where Ephron, the guy who's sitting there listening, chimes in and says, Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went in at the gate of his city, "No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it, and the sight of the sons of my people I give it to you. Bury your dead." Now, we've seen that this is pretty generous, and it is generous, but there's a little bit of a clarification here. The person at risk, Ephron, was sitting listening to this, and he answered warmly amongst all the people. And he did so on purpose. He did it publicly because this would have given him more validity and less shame to what he was addressing. He offers to give Abraham the location and repeats this 3 times, mentioning nothing about payment. Now, this could be a moment of charity or a moment of diversion, as land owned is not really, or land loaned is not land owned. So there seems to be this reluctance that he's giving up. He wants to give up the land. We see that because he specifically offers the cave as he refines that versus the entire land. He says, I give you the field, I give you the cave. See that he's getting a little bit more specific. He might not want to actually sell the land. He may just want to give him a space in honor to bury his wife and his family. Now, while we don't know whether Ephron truly wanted to sell the property or not, he answers Abraham publicly to bring honor to the offer and to Abraham. Now, Abraham, though, being a smart guy, bowed it down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, "But if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me that I may bury my dead there." Again, Abraham bowed down to show his gratitude and politeness, but he was also playing a little politics here because he wanted to show the importance of the agreement they were discussing. And so notice people of the land was repeated twice amongst the elders. So whether or not Ephron's offer was free or not, Abraham knows the value of owning the land itself versus borrowing the land. And he insisted on buying the field rather than Ephron's offer to give the cave. Notice again, we see here that he wanted the field. He dismissed the cave, which was offered by Ephron earlier. And he really wanted to engage in ownership of this land. Well, Ephron names his price, and he answered Abraham by saying, "My Lord, listen to me, a piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." See, it was generous of him, but there's a little bit of culture mixed in here. Ephron was trying to protect his shame in an honor-shame culture. He was finally forced publicly to commit, and Ephron offers up a price for the field. Whether it was fair or not, we don't know, but he offered up a price. He minimizes the cost of the land to save himself some shame when he says, "What is this between you and me?" He's trying to make it a little bit lighter so he wouldn't be embarrassed publicly tying money to death and bringing shame on his name. However, he does try one last time to get him to take it for free by dismissing this offer from Abraham. Abraham's a smart guy, and he pays the land, and the land gets transferred. Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron and Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites before all who went in at the great city. Abraham agrees to the stated price of Ephron immediately. He weighs out the money, pays it, whether it was fair or not. And now this is all done in public, which pretty much secures that this is a done deal. Now Abraham owned a land and is given this in great detail in the text. So we see to the degree to which he owned the land. That's where we talk about owning the trees and owning the specific locations and the cave itself and the field and the whole area and the whole region. And again, denotes that this was Abraham's land. He was laying historical claim in the text that it was his property. This also ties the land to the Israelite people in the future. So this was his land, even though it was in the land of the Hittites. So now that the job is done, we see that after this, Abraham buried his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. At this moment, Abraham takes care of Sarah's burial, expressing thereby his faith in God's promise that he will possess this land. And note that the fact that the land is not theirs during Sarah or Abraham's entire earthly life, again, the region around the land he purchased, and that points forward to a future when he will own the land in the resurrection of the dead, which you can check out in Hebrews 11, 13 through 16. So here's that journey, that burial trip. He went from Beersheba up to Hebron to bury his wife and to bury his family, or to prepare burial for his family in the future. And now Abraham has a little bit of land to his own name in the middle of Hebron. So this is all summarized again in Genesis 23:20, when we see the field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. Abraham's purchase of the field and cave meant that his descendants would now own his land in perpetuity. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Rebekah, and Leah would later be laid to rest in this cave. So Sarah is now buried, and a new story is beginning. Abraham is coming to the end of his life. His wife has passed, Isaac. His son has been born, and now the faith has been secured in that bloodline. And I just love this picture because we see this beauty of Sarah's tomb, of her being buried. And look at this face of Abraham. Everyone else here is walking away, and Abraham was deeply grieved. He loved his wife, and he was deeply mourning after her. But the good news is that there's a future for Abraham. There was a future for his people. And we see that in the next set of stories that Pastor Ryan's going to cover, when particularly Genesis 24:23, when the scout that Abraham sends to find a wife for his son Isaac says, "Please tell me whose daughter you are." Well, this direct line connected between Isaac and Rebekah, which will be covered in the next session. So gathering folks, thank you so much for your time. I love you, appreciate you, and I'm grateful for you. If you need anything, shoot me an email. But again, I'll talk to you in a couple weeks. Next week, Pastor Ryan will be discussing Isaac. Have a blessed day. Bye-bye.